In 2019, a South Korean film called Parasite won the Academy Award for Best Picture. It was the first non-English language film to do so. Director Bong Joon-ho said the story came from his observations of Korean society, the gap between the wealthy and the poor, the people who live above ground, and the people who live below it. What he did not say, what almost no English language coverage mentioned, was that the film's darkest elements were not entirely invented. They were drawn from a real case, a case involving a real family, a real basement, and a series of events that Korean investigators have never fully explained. This is the story Bong Joon-ho didn't tell you. To understand the case, you need to understand what a banjiha is. In South Korean cities, particularly Seoul, a banjiha is a semi-basement dwelling, a living space that sits partially below street level, with windows that look out at pavement height. They were originally constructed as civil defense shelters during the Cold War era, converted to residential use in the 1970s and 1980s as Seoul's population expanded faster than its housing supply could accommodate. By the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of people lived in banjiha. They were affordable, they were damp, they received almost no natural light. In summer, they flooded. In winter, the heating bills consumed a disproportionate share of already thin incomes. The people who lived in them were, almost universally, the people who had no other option. In 1999, a family of 4 was living in a banjiha in the Mapo district of Seoul. The father, Kim Jae-won, was 44 years old. He had worked as a day laborer for most of his adult life, construction sites, loading docks, whatever work was available. His wife, Park Hyun-suk, was 41. They had 2 children, a son of 17 and a daughter of 14. The family had lived in the banjiha for 6 years. They owed 4 months of back rent. On the evening of October 14, 1999, the family who owned the building, a couple in their 60s who lived on the upper floor, came downstairs to discuss the overdue rent. What happened next is the part of the story that investigators spent 2 years trying to reconstruct. By the following morning, both members of the landlord couple were dead. Kim Jae-won and his wife were gone. The 2 children were alone in the banjiha when neighbors, alarmed by the silence from the upper floor, contacted police. The official cause of death for both landlords was determined to be blunt force trauma. The banjiha showed signs of a significant struggle. Kim Jae-won and Park Hyun-suk were arrested 3 days later at a relative's home in Busan. At trial, Kim Jae-won's account of what had happened that night was consistent but deeply contested by prosecutors. He said the confrontation over rent had escalated. He said he had not planned what occurred. He said he had panicked. Prosecutors argued the evidence told a different story. The case proceeded through the Korean court system over the following 2 years, drawing attention not because of its scale. It was, in the taxonomy of violent crime, a contained incident, but because of what it represented. 2 people dead in the stairwell between a basement and an upper floor, a family destroyed by a debt they could not pay, a building that had been, for years, a container for exactly the kind of pressure that eventually finds a way to release. Bong Joon-ho has spoken in interviews about the sources that shaped Parasite. He has cited his own experience growing up in Seoul, his observations of the city's economic stratification, and his long-standing interest in the relationship between physical space and social position. In a 2019 interview with The Guardian following the film's Cannes premiere, he described the banjiha as a space that contained within its architecture the entire logic of Korean inequality, that to live below street level was to be, in a very literal sense, beneath the notice of the world above.
He has not publicly named the 1999 Mapo case as a specific source. What Korean film scholars and journalists have documented, however, is that Bong spent significant time in the early 2000s researching real cases of violence that had occurred in the boundary spaces between Seoul's wealthy and poor households, cases where the physical proximity of extreme wealth and extreme poverty had produced outcomes that a more geographically separated society might never have generated. The 1999 case was among the most extensively covered of these in the Korean press. The structural parallels between the case and the film are precise enough to have been noted by multiple Korean critics at the time of Parasite's release. A basement-dwelling family, an upper-floor wealthy household, a confrontation that begins as a financial dispute and ends in violence. A staircase that functions as both the literal and symbolic boundary between two worlds. Bong has said that Parasite is not based on any single event. That is almost certainly true. What is also true is that the 1999 Mapo case gave Korean audiences watching Parasite a recognition that international audiences did not share, a sense that the film's darkness was not invented but excavated, that somewhere beneath the fiction was a layer of actual ground. The two children who were left alone in the Bong-ji-ha that morning in October 1999 were placed in state care following their parents' arrests. Their father was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years. Their mother received a lesser sentence. The building was eventually demolished as part of a district redevelopment project in 2004. Where the children are now, no record publicly confirms.
The 1999 Mapo case was not an isolated incident. It was one data point in a pattern that Korean housing researchers and criminologists had been documenting since the early 1990s, a pattern connecting Bong-ji-ha living conditions to elevated rates of domestic stress, mental health deterioration, and, in a smaller but statistically significant number of cases, violence. By 1999, approximately 1.2 million people in Seoul were living in semi-basement or basement dwellings. The majority were families, not single occupants, not temporary residents, but households that had been in these spaces for years, sometimes decades, with no realistic pathway to anything above street level. The conditions were documented extensively in Korean social welfare reports from the period. Chronic dampness causing respiratory illness in children. Flooding during monsoon season that destroyed the few possessions families had accumulated. Absence of natural light contributing to depression rates that were measurably higher in Bong-ji-ha residents than in the general population. Noise from street traffic penetrating the thin walls at all hours. And debt. Consistently, pervasively, debt. The relationship between landlord and Bong-ji-ha tenant in 1990 Seoul was not the relationship between two parties with roughly equivalent negotiating positions. The landlord held the lease, the deposit, and the keys. The tenant held nothing except the ongoing need for shelter and the accumulating weight of what they owed. When that weight became unbearable, the results were sometimes administrative. Eviction, displacement, the quiet erasure of a family from one address, and their reappearance months later at another one equally far below street level. And sometimes, the results were what happened in Mapo in October 1999. South Korea's government began a formal program to reduce Bong-ji-ha habitation in 2022, prompted at least in part by a tragic incident that year in which a family of 3 drowned in their semi-basement apartment during a flash flood caused by unusually heavy rainfall. The incident made international headlines. Parasite had been released 3 years earlier. The connection was made immediately and globally. The government's target is to eliminate Bong-ji-ha as a residential category entirely by 2030. As of 2024, an estimated 200,000 people in Seoul still live in semi-basement dwellings. The staircase between the world above and the world below remains.
Parasite won 4 Academy Awards on February 9, 2020. In his acceptance speech for Best Original Screenplay, Bong Joon-ho said that he had written the film to explore a very simple idea, that the line between those who have and those who do not is not a moral line or a cultural line, but a physical one, that it can be measured in steps, in floors, in the distance between a window in the street outside it. Korean audiences understood what he meant in a way that others could only approximate, because in South Korea, that distance is not a metaphor, it is an address. The Kim family in Parasite are fictional. The Parks are fictional. The violence that erupts from the pressure of their proximity is the invention of a filmmaker who understood that sometimes the most honest thing a story can do is take what is real and make it slightly more visible. The family in Mapo in 1999 were not fictional. Their debt was not fictional. The staircase was not fictional. The 2 children, left alone in the Banji-ha that morning, grew up in state care. They would be in their late 30s now. Whether either of them has seen Parasite, no record confirms. Whether either of them needed to see it to understand what it was about, that, at least, seems clear.